This is George Zilbergeld. This is our latest program of Citizens Going Wild, Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Hype and Glory. And today I'm especially pleased because we have as a guest Mitchell Bard. He's a scholar who's the executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, one of the leading authorities on U.S. Middle East policy, and he's the creator and director of the Jewish Virtual Library, the world's most complete online encyclopedia of Jewish history and culture. However, we're going to talk to him about something else that he's also written. He's written over a dozen books, by the way. I bumped into him years ago because of this particular book, which he probably may not be able to see, so I'll read the name. Myths and Facts, A Guide to the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Years ago, there was practically nothing available except an early version of this book for people who wanted to get the facts and be able to defend Israel against the onslaught that was then starting up. In fact, I remember reading an article about how on college campuses, not that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, when the attacks started in earnest against Israel, Jewish students would show up for the fight, but then they would retreat very quickly because they didn't know the facts of the situation. And so when people attacked Israel, they just beat a hasty retreat. All they would have needed is this book, and that's all it's needed today as well. One of the nice things about this book is that it's so easy to absorb, and it's kind of a fun read. It's question and answer, myth and fact, and each section is very small, a paragraph or a few paragraphs. In addition, and this is what I really like, the facts, the anecdotes, the history is given in such a fashion that you can use those facts as a poleaxe to demolish your victims. Don't use an actual poleaxe. I remember the first thing I saw when I looked in this book years ago was the Muslims were talking about how they were just trying to regain their land. And but they also, you quoted Mitchell, the Syrian general, who was very proud to say that this massacre of the Jews, genocide of the Jews, would be spoken proudly in the same terms as we speak of the massacres perpetuated by Genghis Khan. Once you say something like this, and I've used it, you put the other fellow on a defensive. This person, of course, who spoke, the Syrian general, echoed a view that others have echoed as well. If you've only heard of the Palestinian refugees, you will quickly find out by looking in this book that actually there were more Jewish refugees, which most people do not know. It has all of the good stuff in here, and I'd recommend it to anyone who wants to stand up and be counted when we're talking about attacks on Israel. Let me start by asking you this. What do you make of how Jews are doing in America nowadays? How are we doing?
I think Jews overall are doing great. We're in positions of influence in politics, in industry, in media, in all phases of American life. And I think it's been a tremendous success story for American Jews living in America.
What do you say, though, about the negative view of Israel that you get from a great deal of the media?
Well, Israel has never been as popular as a lot of people think it was. If you think back to what many people think was the golden age right after the 67 war, when plucky little Israel as David defeated the Arab Goliath, if you look at the Gallup poll back then, only about 55% of Americans sympathized with Israel. That's hardly overwhelming love. And actually today, the figure is 60%. So it's actually improved despite years of negative press media bias in some of the most prestigious newspapers, especially the New York Times, the unremitting criticism of Israel by various detractors in the media and on college campuses. And yet support for Israel has remained strong. We see some disturbing developments, especially on the political left and within some elements of the Democratic Party. So those things are disturbing. But there is a lot of improvement in many ways because of the degree of investment by philanthropists and others in trying to help Jewish students, for example, on campus that didn't exist back in the old days when I was on college campus, and it was a pretty lonely fight. And I remember sitting out on the Berkeley campus with a little card table and a Israeli flag, and next to me was the Muslim Student Association with a big sign that said Zionism is racism, and they were handing out highlights of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And marching in front of me every day were a group of Arab students protesting the Lebanon war. And it was basically me and a handful of friends who made up what was then the Israel Action Committee at Berkeley. Today, thanks in part to a project that I ran where we brought over 100 visiting Israeli scholars to more than 50 universities. Berkeley today still is one of the most anti-Israel campuses in many ways, but it also has the strongest Israel studies program in the United States, which very few people know about. So I think one problem is we focus on the bad news, and there is some positive things going on, and we don't hear enough about them.
Well, my family has always specialized in looking at the bad news. How do you account for the rather vicious attitude toward Israel on college campuses? Is that solely because there are so many Palestinian students, or is it because the left has, to a fair degree, taken over the liberal arts on college campuses?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. Trying to explain anti-Semitism in general is really impossible to say how people come to the irrational view of Jews that they have. I'm actually about to publish a story, an article about the historical situation on the campus, because if you look back, for example, at reports from 1989, you have the same kinds of things being said about the campus that you have said today. That is, how anti-Israel the campus was, how the left on the campus was particularly hostile, how you had a problem with Middle East studies professors, how Jewish students were not prepared for what they faced on campus. A lot of those things have been going on for decades now. Some of the things have changed. You have more vitriol, I think, especially from the left. You have thousands of professors who now support a boycott of Israel, while at the same time saying that they believe in academic freedom. They don't seem to see the hypocrisy of that position. And you have more Jewish students, I think, affiliating with the far left anti-Israel groups. It used to be primarily Arab students who were the leaders of the anti-Israel movement. Today, it's not just Arab students, it's people who are politically on the left. They call themselves progressives. You have Jewish students, and they seem to buy into this narrative that the Palestinians are underdogs who are being persecuted in the same way that other minorities are persecuted. And you now have this whole notion of intersectionality, which really isn't new. They just have a new name for what they've always done, which is to try to attach the Palestinian cause to more popular social justice issues. So right now, the cause du jour is the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, the issue of racism in this country is very important, but the notion that the treatment of Palestinians has anything to do with the way African Americans are treated in this country is just ahistorical.
Well, I like to worry ahead. So let me ask you another question. in this area. Do you think that this constant negativity toward Israel, let's say at schools like Columbia University and other schools, will have a long-term effect? Not that people will turn into anti-Semites, but it will wear away at the support of Israel.
Well, that's certainly the strategy of Israel's detractors. You have the Arab governments and individuals who have invested billions of dollars into universities in an effort to change the dynamic and change the narrative and to whitewash the history of the Middle East. That is always a concern. We don't know how this will play out in the future. I tend to be more of an optimist because I look again at what's happened over these last 40, 50 years and how this has been going on. And yet people haven't completely turned on Israel in the way many people have feared. If you look at public opinion polls, for example, we look today and we say, look, young people are much less sympathetic toward Israel than older people. That's always been true. So if you look at the people who were young 30 or 40 years ago who were less pro-Israel than their parents and grandparents, today those people are the parents and grandparents, and they're the ones who are more pro-Israel. But again, I agree with you that this drumbeat of anti-Israel messaging, of criticizing Israel for every conceivable sin, real and imagined, can't help but have some negative impact over time. And it's very concerning. And as you mentioned, the fact that too few students are knowledgeable enough to respond to this, I think is a major failure of the American Jewish community. I mean, as I say, we've seen this now for decades. Why are we still talking about this being a problem? Why have Jewish educators not provided the knowledge, the alphabet of Israel history that these students need when they get to college? Now, parents are suddenly shocked when they hear about what's going on the college campus, but their students, their kids aren't being taught in school, especially even in day schools, what they need to know. I actually, there was an article in E-Jewish Philanthropy, a publication of philanthropists, where an educator was saying how schools shouldn't be teaching Israel advocacy. And I thought this was absurd, that you don't have to call it Israel advocacy, it's Israel education, that students, if they're knowledgeable about Israel and they learn certain skills of advocacy, which aren't necessarily unique to talking about Israel, learning how to do public speaking, how to be a critical analyst of the media, those kinds of skills, every high school student should be learning anyway. So I think it's very unfortunate that there are educators today who are literally afraid to teach about Israel because they're afraid it will have some sort of backlash against them and that students will reject it in the way they don't want to eat their spinach, even if it's good for them.
Yes, I recently had a conversation with someone who heads up actually a Holocaust center, and he said something like this, which startled me. Susan Tuckman, the lawyer for ZOA, told me the following story, that she was going up with a bunch of papers in her hands to speak to someone in administration, and this black student came down. He was friendly, and he laughed, and he said, you know something? Whenever I see a Jew going up to the administration building, they have a bunch of books and pieces of paper in their hand. When we go up to the administration building, it's to occupy it. And then they both laughed and got on with their day. Do you think that Jews have been, I don't know, cowardly or, yeah, I guess I want to use that word, cowardly in fighting back? Groups like Hillel are so mild. They drive me crazy. And
yeah, I wrote an article about this. I've written several about this, how Exactly what you said. That this was my experience. I remember back at UCLA when there was a problem of anti-Semitism when I was a graduate student in the 80s, and we went and complained to the administration. We brought some of the Jewish students from the law school, and we said, if you don't do something about this, we're going to sue you. And they basically laughed and said, go ahead. In the meantime, as you say, the African-American students went and they took over the administration building when they got upset about whatever the issue was at the time. The Hispanic students were able to get the administration to shut down or suspend the fraternity because they had a Viva Zapata party that had upset them. So, yeah, the Jews, someone had a good line about this a few years ago. One of our visiting professors was in one of the university, I think at Rice in Houston, and was in a debate with some vitriolic anti-Israel Arab American professor. And the Arab American professor just was, spouting all sorts of propaganda, and the Israeli professor was trying to present, scholarly facts. And someone described the interaction as the Israeli taking a spreadsheet to a gunfight. And that's the way Jews have historically behaved. We want to talk you to death, whereas the other side takes action. So, one of these articles I had said what we should be teaching, we should be getting 60s radicals to come in to teach Jewish students how to be activists, how to be protesters, because we don't teach them basic protest activities or protest techniques. The other thing is there's been this tendency, which is driving me crazy, that Jews have joined in with other groups to say that we need these safe spaces on campus, that Jewish students are in danger, that they have to be afraid and should be cowering, in their dorms because of how serious anti-Semitism is on the campus. And we're, I think, creating a generation of snowflakes where, I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day who's a little older than I was, and he was talking about how in his day, they were coming after them with steel bars. Students on campus today, the most experience is someone calls them a name, they say nasty things about Israel. Nobody's physically accosting them except in very rare circumstances, but they act as though they're petrified to fight back. I think about the difference with Israelis. Israeli students, they're out, they just got out of the army fighting wars. Can you imagine them being on the campus and being afraid because they saw a swastika on a Hillel building or because someone said something nasty about Israel? It's ridiculous. But for some reason, American Jewish students have been coddled and taught to be afraid, and that they shouldn't be speaking out for fear that there'll be some sort of retribution against them. And I think a bigger problem still is the faculty. Where you have students come and go, as you know, whereas faculty are forever. They're like Supreme Court justices. And so when you have an anti-Israel faculty member, he will, who is teaching a political agenda, they can affect hundreds, thousands of students over the course of a career, as opposed to, a handful of students who come and go. And, at some campuses, there's nothing going on. There's the Columbias, there's the Berkeleys, there's UCLA, but 99% of campuses are apathetic. They're not anti-Israel. Students don't care about anything. So we have to focus on those places where we have a problem. And the other problem is administrations, that even if Ms. Tuckman gets to the administration and presents them with evidence of problem on the campus, the administration isn't going to do anything because they basically adopted the view that every minority is protected except Jews. That is, you could never get away with saying things about Black students or female students or LBGT students that you can get away with when you talk about Jews or about Israel. They simply have a double standard, and it's really been appalling to see how that's played out over the years.
Have you ever given any thought to the question of why does having absolute job protection make you more cowardly? Teachers have tenure, which is pretty good, pretty close to absolute job protection. And yet the Jewish professors are acting as if, the Wehrmacht is outside the door.
Well, I think you have a few problems with some Jewish professors. Obviously, not all. You have some professors who share the views of the critics. You have very liberal Jewish professors, just as you have very liberal professors in general, who sympathize with the views of the anti-Israel groups. You have professors who are afraid that this will alienate their colleagues and will put them in a particular box that they don't want to be in. You're right, I don't understand why they should be afraid, although there are reports, and this is very difficult to prove, that professors who are pro-Israel or writing about Israel have reportedly had difficulty sometimes getting things published in academic journals. So they have to be somewhat wary of that. Even more problematic, of course, are junior faculty who don't have tenure. They're absolutely petrified to speak out because of the likelihood that they'll be denied tenure by faculty who disagree with their political views.
Something much worse than that actually happened to me. I wanted to ask you something else. I have daydreamed about the fact that when the people attack Israel or have these so-called checkpoints that imitate supposedly what the Israelis do with the Arabs, that there would be Jewish students who would hand out a little packet. And the main point in the packet is that the the people who took out the most black slaves out of Black Africa and brought them to North Africa were the Muslims. Would that be kosher to use information like that? And by the way, you can also bring up the question of, what was done to the male blacks. And there are pictures available of very recent slavery in places like Mauritania and the Sudan. Would that be something of use, do you think?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I remember, again, back in my days at Berkeley, we were making exactly that argument. We were talking about Arab slavery and the Arabs' history in the slave trade, which, as you say, continues up until this day in a few places. The problem tends to be that critics of Israel then start to accuse you of whataboutism. That is, whenever you bring up what Arab states are doing, or what other human rights abusers are doing, they say, basically that's very nice, but this is what the Israelis are doing. And for the most part, they don't care. What's even more shocking to me is how all of these advocates for the Palestinians have no concern whatsoever for how Palestinians are being treated by their fellow Palestinians or their fellow Arabs. If you look at how Palestinians are being driven out of Syria today because of the civil war, if you look at how Palestinians are denied most rights by the Lebanese, if you look at how civil rights are being denied to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, not by Israel, but by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. You never hear any of that from the BDS supporters or for anybody else who says they care about Palestinian human rights. I mean, one of the most absurd things is when you hear groups like they call themselves Queers for Palestine, and they want to criticize Israel about the treatment of gays, where Tel Aviv was rated the #1 tourist destination for gays in the world, and we know that gays are persecuted in the West Bank and Gaza by their fellow Palestinians and run and escape to Israel because they could be killed in those areas by fellow Palestinians. So this hypocrisy is just stunning, but I don't know how to get around it because it just perpetuates itself.
So even if you brought pictures of the gays being hung from construction cranes in Iran, it wouldn't do any good. You're saying it wouldn't.
Well, I think it's worth pointing these things out, but the hardcore isn't going to be moved. But I think one of the messages should be we shouldn't be trying to influence the hardcore. I sort of divide the campus into, far left anti-Israel critics, and you have the far right pro-Zionists. We don't need to talk to the pro-Zionists; they already agree, and we don't need to talk to the anti-Israel people because there's nothing we can say that will make them agree. But they're the students who know very little, pay very little attention, who are the ones who are more open to persuasion and influence. And especially we need to focus on that slice of the population that is more to the left, that identify with progressive causes, that aren't necessarily pro-Israel. I mean, not necessarily anti-Israel, but can easily be moved in that direction if we don't attend to their interests. And we have to, not everyone can talk to them. I can't necessarily talk to someone from the progressive movement because I don't speak their language. But there are plenty of Jews who are progressive. I've said for a long time, I've said this to the Israeli government, that they should bring left-wing Zionists to speak on college campuses. You don't need Likudniks to come. They're not going to influence anybody, but there are plenty of people in Israel who are people of the left. They speak the language of progressivism, but they're ardent Zionists, and they can defend the state of Israel. I had a woman, again, one of my visiting professors was a woman who was affiliated with Meretz, the fairly left-wing party in Israel, but she had spent many years representing Israel at international forums related to women's issues. And she was used to Israel being pilloried by international women's movements, but she, even as a left-winger, was perfectly prepared and happy to defend Israel and Zionism in those forums. So I think that's one of the things that we've really been missing, is finding the right people to talk to the audience that we can have influence with. The Bernie Sanders supporters who maybe haven't gone completely off the deep end yet, but maybe reachable if someone talks to them. And there's actually a organization created by liberal Democrats for this exact purpose, trying to talk to their fellow Democrats to keep them from joining the squad and becoming outspoken critics of Israel. And
what organization do you think comes the closest to what you'd like to see?
I don't think any of them do at the moment.
Yeah.
I think the mainstream organizations have tried in some ways. I think the American Jewish Committee, for example, in reaching out to the Hispanic community. I wrote an article with my wife, who's originally from Argentina, in Hadassah magazine. I don't know, it must be maybe 40 years ago, where the two of us were arguing, the Hispanic population is growing. It's going to become a very influential political force in this country, and we should be educating them about Israel. And at the time, practically no one in the pro-Israel community was talking to the Hispanic world. That's fortunately changed over the years, but mostly people were focused on the Black community. We were very obsessed with Black-Jewish relations and ignored Hispanic. The same with the Asian community. How many organizations are having outreach to the Asian American community and trying to educate them? They're not predisposed to anti-Semitism or anti-Israel feelings at all, but they don't know very much about Israel. So we need to be talking to them.
I have found that the Indians actually are predisposed to like Jews and Israel, I'm not sure why. Maybe some rabbi came through there in the 15th century. But I find a lot of the Indians to be very sympathetic. But I don't find any Jews, except individuals like me, making any organized effort in that direction.
Are you talking about Native Americans, or are you talking about Indians from India?
No, I mean the Indians from India.
Oh, yeah. It's funny, again, that you mentioned that, because when I worked for AIPAC back in the late 80s, I actually was asked to write an article about India-Israel relations in the Indian American magazine, because they were just beginning at that point to recognize that Israel had something to offer. And now there's actually a guy at AIPAC who has very close ties with the Indian government and the Indian community in terms of promoting this relationship. And that's really grown. That's one of the major success stories for Israel, is its growth in the relations economically, politically, militarily with India.
I find a lot of the Indians even have a Yiddish sense of humor.
Well, Israel's also expanded its relations with China. It's become problematic with the Trump administration in some respects, but overall, there's a very strong trade relationship now that didn't exist not so many years ago. And it's, I think, a reflection of how strong Israel's position is in the world. That it's a reflection also of how big a failure the boycott movement has been. I mean, Israel has relations with more countries today than ever before. It has a burgeoning trade relationship with more countries than ever before. I mean, you look at England, for example, which was ground zero for the boycott movement. Israel's been having record trade over the past several years with England. So, I like to look at some of the more positive stories because you hear them so infrequently. And there is good news out there. But we have to keep, dealing with the onslaught of anti-Israel activity. I mean, we just had more stuff coming out in the New York Times that was outrageous. There just seemed to be an incessant source of inaccuracy, bias, and misleading information. And it is the paper read by more people in positions of influence.
We have something just delicious about hating Jews. If you were going to join one organization to, let us say, fight back, which organization would that be?
Oh, I can't pick one, otherwise all the others will yell at me.
All right, we'll pick a handful.
Look, there are a bunch of, there are a number of organizations. ADL does good work on anti-Semitism. I think Hillel does good work on many of the campuses. It really depends on the leader on a particular campus, because Hillel is a bit of a fiefdom where it depends on who the local lord of the manor is on campus. Stand With Us is one of the strongest organizations in fighting for Israel. There's a student group called Students Supporting Israel that's started by Israelis. That's become a very strong group. So, the American Jewish Committee, AIPAC, all the, most of the Aleph Bet organizations do reasonably good work, but it's simply not enough. And some of the things that we're all doing are not necessarily in the right direction. Especially, my biggest concern is really in education, and that we provide the next generation with the knowledge they need to be able to understand and appreciate Israel, and to be able to stand up for Israel. And I just don't think it's being done in a comprehensive way across the country, across all of the Jewish schools, and certainly not in the public schools.
One of the things, by the way, I should tell you that I invited Mitchell Barr to come to my campus when I was teaching at Montclair State University. And one thing that impressed me very much was not only was he convincing, but he had absolute control of the room. And when people tried to interfere in that annoying new left style, he just put them out of business in a split second. Are you still going on college campuses?
Well, not as much as I used to. Unfortunately, I don't get as many invitations as I would like, but you know, it's important to get out there. I'd like to be able to give workshops and speak to the pro-Israel students on campus, as well as to give broader campus-wide lectures to try to educate a larger group. And I don't mind people who have questions about Israel or who have criticism about Israel. I'm perfectly willing to uh, listen and to address their concerns. And not every criticism of Israel is unfounded.
No,
Israel's not perfect, and I'm perfectly willing to point out some of the flaws that Israel has. The problem is when people see nothing but flaws, and that their expression of criticism of Israel isn't because they want to see Israeli society improve, it's that they want to see Israel disappear. That's where the problem emerges. And I think that's that's one of the concerns I have with some of the organizations on the Jewish left who claim to be pro-Israel, but can't seem to talk or say anything positive about Israel. They only seem to be able to talk about Israel's flaws. What I also like to tell students is, look, if you're in a room full of people who love Israel and want to see it be a better place, hey, let's have that discussion about what concerns you about Israel, what you don't like, or what you disagree with. But it's very different when you have that conversation or try to bring it up in a room full of people who either don't like Israel or don't know very much about Israel, because then the only thing they're going to hear and the only thing they're going to know about Israel is the negative side.
well, I live about 20 minutes away from Rutgers University, and I'm an alumnus. And they have Professor Puar, who goes around the country saying the Jews are stealing body parts from Palestinians, which is, of course, a classic blood libel. And they had a few Jewish professors who complained, but then the administration came out and said, this lady is a world-class scholar and we stand behind her 100%. And so then the Jewish professor said, oh, okay. And they just went on. It's hard to believe that you could have someone who says blacks are stealing body parts from whites and nothing come of it. But
No, it's again, it's the double standard. I mean, remember Larry Summers got drummed out of Harvard University as the president because he had made some comment about women's skills in math, I think. But you have these professors who are saying the most outrageous things and getting away with it. I mean, what is problematic, and Puar is an example, is the way, as you know, you get promoted in university is by publishing.
right.
Well, how is it that publishers of university presses are publishing the works of these people whose work has no scholarly value whatsoever? I mean, Puar wrote this book about how Israelis purposely maim Palestinians. Not only got it published by a academic press, she got an award for being one of the best books. So
That's
as long as you can engage in propaganda and shoddy scholarship and get published and promoted, we're going to have these problems in college campuses. And it's been true for a long time, as my colleague Martin Kramer wrote a long time ago, that you have this groupthink, especially in Middle East studies departments, where they're militantly anti-Israel in most of the departments, and they just hire like-minded people, year after year. So you can never break through and change those departments. That's one of the reasons that I was involved in trying to promote the field of Israel studies. When I started my project to bring visiting Israeli professors to college campuses, there were, I think, 3 or maybe 4 programs in Israel studies in the whole country. Most universities had either 0 or 1 course on Israel. And it was not surprising then that campuses wouldn't have very sympathetic attitudes toward Israel and that students wouldn't be learning much about Israel. And after bringing 100 professors to 50 different campuses, we were able to promote and be the catalyst for creating Israel Studies Centers at Berkeley and at American University to strengthen theirs, and professors, endowed professors at Ohio State and San Francisco State, a whole new burgeoning discipline has emerged just in the last decade or so. And it's only because philanthropists started investing in it, because the universities weren't going to say, oh boy, what we really need is an Israel Studies department. The only reason they did it was someone said, here, it's $5 million, and we're going to endow a chair in Israel Studies. But one of the problems even with that is in the early days, philanthropists weren't aware of how universities are willing to misuse their money. So we had the classic example at Berkeley where a very philanthropic individual said, Berkeley's a problem, I'm going to fix it. Here's $5 million for a visiting scholar in Israel Studies. Berkeley said, thank you very much. They put the chair in charge of one of the most anti-Israel professors on the campus. And not surprisingly, the first visiting professor was an anti-Zionist. So if you're not careful about how you fund things at the university, you can actually make things worse. But money is the name of the game.
Yes.
I discovered a number of years ago, to my surprise, and maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, that universities don't care about education. They care about money. So if you hurt them in the pocketbook, if donors stop giving them major contributions, if they continue to promote people who are unqualified, not that they're critics of Israel, you can be a critic of Israel, but if you're unqualified to be a professor in the field that you're teaching, you shouldn't be getting promoted. And if universities stop getting money from donors, they would see the light, or giving them money to create Israel Studies. Again, we have a cautionary tale at Columbia, where there was a study done a number of years ago which showed how anti-Israel one particular department at Columbia was. And there were some one professor in particular who engaged in a number of problematic activities and statements. And to make a long story short, the Jewish trustees at Columbia said, we're going to fix this problem. Here's $5 million for an Israel Studies professor. And again, the university said, thank you very much, and then hired somebody who was not a good scholar of Israel and not somebody sympathetic to Israel. And Columbia has remained problematic to this day.
Let me ask you something. And apropos of what you just said, how the hell do you keep your spirits up and keep going with all of this negative news?
Well, I mean, one thing is the book Myths and Facts you held up. I mean, it's always very rewarding when someone comes up to me and says, I read Myths and Facts, and thank you. Because of that, now I know, how to respond to the critics. In fact, I was like most college students. I'm sympathetic to college students who don't get an education before they get to college. I heard the criticism on campus, and I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't been educated. And then one day I got in the mail this book called Myths and Facts. And all of a sudden I saw there were answers. I never imagined that decades later I'd be the one writing it. And people sometimes come up to me, people who are a little older, who will say, I have the 1975 copy of Myths and Facts, and it used to be this thick. What happened? Now it's 400 pages. I said, if the Arabs would quit making myths, I wouldn't have to keep making it bigger. And so now, the good news is that I can update it on a weekly basis, and I do on the Jewish Virtual Library website. So you can find the latest things. Last week I wrote something about this accusation that Israel wants to create Bantustans in the West Bank, or misinformation about Israel's plan to apply sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, or the myth about settlements being the obstacle to peace. You can find answers to all of that, factual answers, footnoted answers in the Jewish Virtual Library, which is updated beyond what's in the printed book. But that's what keeps me going, being able to continue to educate people at the Jewish Virtual Library. We get over 500,000 visitors a month from more than 200 countries. The depressing thing is I can't get the financial support I need to keep the library going in the future. You would think that philanthropists would say, boy, what could be better than a resource that reaches 500,000 people a month in 200 countries, teaching them about all aspects of Jewish history, politics, and culture. But we're having a difficult time raising the money that we need to keep this going. But every day, I put more articles on. We have over 25,000 entries, and it's fascinating. I'll update. Today, I was updating a page on Ukraine where they just found a basement full of bodies that were of Jews who were killed during the Holocaust. I was adding some State Department documents where you could see how members of the State Department were trying to sabotage American support for partition. I was adding articles about Israel's policies toward COVID-19 and how they've helped the Palestinians in treating COVID-19 victims. So there's this constant stream of information I'm able to put out, and that makes me feel good, and I think it's makes a difference.
I think it definitely makes a difference. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us at length about these situations. You made me feel a little better. If not, for nothing else, I like the idea that you're out there shoulder to shoulder with people like myself, if I can give myself a little credit there. And
I appreciate the chance to go wild.
Well, yeah, we don't have a lot of Jews in the suburbs going wild. I want to thank you.